Hello, how are you? Just waiting for a couple of people to pop on now. See, there I am, itching again. It's terrible. Hiya, how are you? Hi Cameron, how are you today? It's a gloriously sunny day here in Wales. I don't know what it's like where you are. Pants are there. Just getting my son dressed in case somebody knocks the door. You're the only one awake. Oh wow. Hiya Gunnar. Blessings to you from Wales to Iceland. Hello. That was my son. Your wife is asleep. Whereabouts in the world are you, Cameron? Probably over in the States. Eli, please stop now. My son's normally upstairs when I'm doing this. Hiya John, how are you? Got up at 4 o'clock this morning. Oh wow. Tell us a little bit about your family. Australia. Hiya Cameron. My family, I've got 2 daughters and 2 sons. My eldest daughter is 27, I think, and she's married. She lives in Manchester, and she's the lead singer of a ministry band who are attached to the Worldwide Message Trust, and they go around singing in schools and prisons and various things, and that's good, John. My younger daughter is 26 and 25 or 26, and she's lives in Coventry with her husband, who's Swiss, and she's just graduated with a BA Honours from Nexus University, which is a Christian university in Coventry, and she's about to start teacher training. And no, I haven't got any grandchildren. I've got a son who's 19, and he's just about to go off to Nexus to study bass guitar and theology, and I've got the little monkey who you just saw, who's 9. So quite an age span. Your daughter's not at home, Cameron. Is she at university or something? And we just we're quite a sort of muso family. Maybe a few years down the track. We're quite a muso family. I used to sing, and managed a lot of bands, and hi darling. Yeah, it's the only place in the country that that you can study theology and a musical instrument, and it was designed as a place just to take a year out originally, about 20 odd years ago, so that you could study theology and do a musical instrument or sing or whatever. But he's it's well, he's been told as of at the moment that they don't start until September, but as of at the moment he's the only bass player on the course this year, which will mean he's getting one-to-one tutoring, which is better than private education. They all get together for the theology side of things, but for their individual musical instruments, they go into separate areas. It's 7:30 at night here. Oh wow! It's 11 in the morning here in Wales, and in Nashville it's about 5 in the morning. Right. Enough about me. I'll maybe do a thing in a couple of weeks, waffling on about myself and what I've been up to. But I thought what would be good to cover next, and I thought one thing that is quite often left out, and you just get snippets of the books, is the 12 minor prophets. So for the next, I don't know how many weeks, we're going to be working through the 12 minor prophets, more or less doing one prophet per session, but there'll be a couple that drift into one another. Have you heard of Corrie ten Boom? Yes, I have. I couldn't tell you why, but I have heard of Corrie ten Boom. So I've decided to do the 12 minor prophets, but I'm going to do it slightly differently, which is my want. I'm going to try and do it in a chronological order. Now, that's easier said than done, because there are lots of versions of this. We are essentially going to be going along the Bible Gateway version, because I know a number of people use the Bible Gateway, and essentially we're going to go along that version. Now there is one thing that you have to realize at this point. The kingdom of the Jews was split into two halves. There was Israel and there was Judah, and the 12 minor prophets were not talking to both sides. They were talking to one side or another, or as in the case of the first minor prophet, Obadiah, he was actually not talking to either side. He was actually talking to Edom, but we'll get into him in a little while. There was only one prophet who talked to both sides, and that was Micah. We will be leaving out Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Daniel, because they aren't classed as minor prophets, and we can do individual studies on them which may take in themselves more than a week, which is a scary thought. I've got to know to talk to you each week, and I'm envisaging Ezekiel taking at least 2 weeks, maybe 3, because there's a lot in Ezekiel. The reasons that they're called minor prophets is not because they're less important than the other prophets, but rather that they have smaller books. In the case of Obadiah, that's the smallest book in the Bible, and it's effectively 1 page. We will also leave out Enoch, who was the first prophet of God, whose book was taken out of the Bible. Apart from the Ethiopian Bible, the book of Enoch is still in that. And I'm sure we'll talk about Enoch at some point. Now we're picking this up at about 848 BC in the kingdom of Judah. This was about the same time as Elisha was the prophet to the Israelites. It's about 15 years since Elijah has died, and Elisha is in full flow. To give you an idea what's occurring in human history around this sort of time, 1358 BC, all right. Tutankhamun dies and is buried inside an immense treasure-filled tomb. 1250 BC, silk fabrics were manufactured in China for the first time. 1200 BC, there were labour strikes in Thebes. So strikes have been a thing since time immemorial. And we had the first Chinese dictionary. 1183 BC, destruction of Troy, and by means of the Trojan horse. 1000 BC, the city of Peking was built. Greek mythology was fully developed, and Chinese mathematics were using root multiplication, geometry, proportions, and the theory of motion. 950 BC, gold vessels and jewellery are popular in Europe. 900, the Celts invade Britain, and Assyrians invent an inflatable skin for soldiers to cross rivers. 850 BC, in Africa, they were using stones and metals to create sculptures. 814 BC was the foundation of Carthage, and 800 BC you had the caste system developing in India. Babylon and the Chinese astronomers were understanding planetary movements. The spoked wheel was used for the first time in Europe, and Homer writes his Iliad and Odyssey, and ice skating is a popular sport in Europe. There we are, you didn't know that, back in 800 BC. In terms of what is happening in Israel, well, apart from the starting of King Jehu's reign, all of the kings and the leaders of Israel are doing what's evil in God's sight. Judah did a little bit better. They started this period with 3 evil kings, and then they had 3 who start off good but turn evil. Then we have Jotham, who was good, Ahaz, who was evil, and Hezekiah, who was good. Manasseh was unusual in that he started off evil and ended up good. Then apart from Josiah, all the rest were evil in God's eyes. In 722, Israel falls into captivity of the Assyrians, and in 586 BC, Judah falls into captivity of the Babylonians. And the timescales of the 12 minor prophets covers 2 years short of about 400 years. All the minor prophets relate to the exile. There are those who speak before the exile and warn of its coming. There are those who speak during the exile and seek to comfort the people, and those who speak after the exile and they get them settled in their new land. And all of the prophets relate to the great tragedy of the Jews, which is losing their land and going back into slavery. Well, I'm just going to have a drink and then we'll start on Obadiah. Excuse me. Obadiah was one of the 12 minor prophets. A prophet is somebody who has heard from God and speaks for God. He has the sensitivity to hear from God and has the courage to pass on what he's heard. And that second element is key, having the courage to pass on what he's heard. The prophets often see things happen before they happen through pictures. So the prophets are often called seers in the Old Testament, and they either see things in visions while they're awake or through dreams while they were asleep. When they're describing things they see in their dreams and visions, they often describe them as happened, as in past tense, because they have to them. They see things happen before they happen, and thus describe them in past tense. This is something which we have to get used to in our readings of them. It's called prophetic perfect tense, and if it is something that is already as if it's something that's already complete, but what they're describing is what they saw happen. Some Bible scholars take it that they're describing things as they happen or after they happen, but the reality of it is that they're describing things and put them down as past tense. They saw incredible details. One prophet describes an attack from an army wearing red coats. Well, when he was writing, he could not possibly have seen the Persian soldiers who were going to wear red when they destroyed Jerusalem. So we have to get used to this type of talking, and where they describe in future events as if they have happened in the past. Enoch was the first prophet of God. to bring a prophecy of God's wrath on his people. And they are often called prophets of doom and gloom merchants, because God normally sends a prophet when there are things going wrong. Now, Enoch, this is one area where people quite often say, well, God just decided that the people of Noah's time were bad, so he brought the flood. That's not true. Enoch started prophesying and being a prophetic voice to the people of Noah's day over 1,000 years before the flood. And Enoch's son Methuselah was it was said that that he the floods would come on the day of his death, and he lived for almost 1,000 years. So God gives people enough time to change their minds. The land started to deteriorate once David had committed adultery with Bathsheba, as we heard a couple of weeks ago. And it continued to go downhill until God started sending prophets that to say that if this continues, I will take away the land for good. A disaster that they found inconceivable. They didn't believe that it would ever happen. They didn't believe that God would ever take away the land that he'd given to David. They were under the impression that as long as they lived near the temple, then they would be okay. They could never see this this bringing down of the temple, because God wouldn't leave his temple to be destroyed, would he? Of course he would. But God never punishes people before warning them first. And he sends prophet after prophet after prophet to try and get them to change their ways. Obadiah was the first written prophet whose writings were to make it into the Bible, and Joel was the second. Obadiah was the first prophet to have his book placed in the Bible, and it's the shortest book in the Bible. It's just one page, 21 verses. And he was around in 845 BC. And as I said, this opens a period of 300 to 400 years of prophet after prophet coming to his people. Joel was around in 835 BC, just 10 years later. We know that Joel came after Obadiah because he quotes some of Obadiah's works. Joel used and built on a particular phrase that Obadiah had coined: the day of the Lord is coming. Now this was a totally new concept, the day of the Lord is coming, but it was a phrase which Obadiah used in his 21 verses. The day of the Lord travels through right into the New Testament and is the day in which God comes to put wrongs right. Now the prophets had two messages, one for God's people and the other for the nations around God's people. And they almost all spoke to both. But Obadiah didn't speak to God's people. He only spoke to the people of Edom. They lived southwest of the Dead Sea. So his prophecy is entirely concerned with another nation, Edom. Can you stop him talking? He didn't speak to Israel at all, and we'll have to ask why. Now, we know very little about him other than his name means worshipper of Yahweh, and to worship is to serve, and to worship and to serve are the same in the Bible. All of what he saw was a vision, which means he was wide awake and he could describe it in great detail. So it's a visual rather than a verbal message. And the Edomites lived southeast of the river, and that was that land was promised to the Israelites, but they never fully occupied this land. The kingdom of Edom was conquered by David, but as David's empire began to shrink, they rebelled and took back their nation. It was located southeast of the Dead Sea, and they had two main cities, Bozrah and Sela. We know Sela nowadays as Petra. It was situated just past the crossroads of the world, and there were two main crossroads, or there was one main crossroads, and it was situated there where the road that went from Africa to Asia crossed the road from Europe to Arabia. It was more or less where Nazareth was situated. The road down as far as down the far side of the Jordan River was called the King's Highway. It's the road that Moses had led the children of Israel, and the two cities of Bozrah and Sela were on that road. This is actually the road that Lawrence of Arabia did all his handiwork on. Petra or Sela is there, and to get to Petra you have to go through a crack in the mountainside, which you have to travel through for about a mile. It's called the Seek, which has 100 to 150 foot rocks on either side. Then ahead you suddenly see a temple about the size of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, carved out of the rock. And you come out of this crack and it looks like a cathedral. And then as you look around yourself, you will see about 1,000 temples are also carved out of the rock. And all around this empty circle in the middle of a mountain. So you're coming into this completely empty circle in the middle of a mountain with carved monuments all around. And in the middle of that is Mount Seir, the old city of Sela, about 2,000 feet high with sheer cliffs on it. And this was where the people of Edom lived, and it was more or less impregnable. There are houses which have been carved into the base of the mountain, but these houses were carved by Nabateans, not the Edomites. And at the peak of the temple, you can actually walk up to the peak of the temple. You can see the Dead Sea out one way and the Red Sea out the other. And the prophecy of Obadiah is about that one mountain. The no, it's Selah is in the Psalms, and this is a place called Selah. The buildings are as big inside as outside, and there's nothing propping up the ceiling. So if you can imagine, you go inside a rock face where everything is carved out, with the mountain Seir in the middle, which is completely impregnable, as I said. Here you find altars where they offered human sacrifice. People still offered to their gods. They lived at the top of the mountain, and they were proud of the fact that no one could bring them down. And Obadiah quotes this: "O proud Mount Seir, you are going to be brought down." What is most radical about this message is that the God of Israel is also the God of other nations. And the message is that the God of Israel will judge all the other nations. That's the message that was really radical for this time, when every people had their own gods to think of, that the God of Israel was over and above all other gods, because effectively he's the Christian God, and the God of the Christians will judge the peoples of every other faith, because essentially God is the one true God. The prophets spread this word: our God is going to judge you too. And the God of Israel is the God with whom every nation will have to deal at one point or other. This was the revolutionary message of the prophets. They didn't just speak to Israel, they spoke to everybody. Obadiah tells the people everywhere that everything is under God's control. When Paul spoke at Athens on Mars Hill, he said, God allots every nation its time and space. It's God who draws the map. And at one point, effectively, the British Empire ruled the world. You could travel right around the world and never leave British soil. It was an empire that the sun never set on. So what happened to this empire? Effectively, we washed our hands of God's people. We washed our hands of the nation of Israel. And when God saw that, he said, if you can't look after Israel, you can't look after anybody. And within 5 years of Britain washing its hands of Israel, the empire was no more. God said, if you can't look after my people, you can't look after any people. What comes out very clearly is God judges other nations by their attitude to his people. How did you treat my people? In the old days, it was how did you treat Israel? But in these days, it's how did you treat the church? And the church meaning not a church, but the church as a body of Christ's people. And the first nation to be judged was Edom for what they did to Israel. Hi Eric, how are you? we're starting to go through the 12 minor prophets, and we're just getting into Obadiah. Jesus said, what you've done to the least of these, you've done to my brethren. What you've done to my brethren, you've done to me. And brethren effectively means Christian. It's only used in Matthew's Gospel, and it's only used when he's describing his disciples. Jesus says, to touch my disciples is to touch me. And Saul, when Saul came across Jesus on the road to Damascus, he encountered this bright shining light and said, who are you? And the voice said, it's Jesus, why are you persecuting me? And Saul realized in an instant that what you do to Christians, you do to their leader, Jesus. Now that God's people are in every nation of the world, that means every nation will be judged. Every nation of the world has to decide what they are going to do with God's people, which is a scary thought. One, on the day of judgment, that will be a major factor. God said to Abraham, whoever blesses you, I'll bless, and whoever curses you, I'll curse. This is seen as the prophets spoke to the nations around Israel. As the prophets spoke to the nations around Israel, nations will with contact with Israel. Nations that had taken up an attitude towards Israel, an attitude that would cost them their future destiny. And there's a vast amount in this tiny book of Obadiah. According to rabbinical tradition, Obadiah was a convert to Judaism from Edom and a servant of the court of Ahab and Jezebel, the queen of Israel. Now we've got an outline of Obadiah, and it's quite neatly split into 4 sections. One nation judged Edom, the nations destroy Edom, and Edom despised Israel. From Edom being judged, he sees all nations being judged. And the second part is from 15 to 21 is all nations being judged. Yahweh punishes the nations and Israel possesses Edom. Edom means red because Esau had red hair, and the Edomites are descendants of Esau. Obadiah says the nations are going to destroy you, and unlike burglars, they will take absolutely everything from you. Nothing will be left behind. You'll be humbled and brought down. You'll lose your territory, lose your status, and all because God hates pride in man. It is one of those sins that gets God's goat. When man thinks he's the great I am, well, we know that God is the great I am, and it's a saying that's flippantly used these days. It's the great I am is pertaining to people. Edom despised Israel. You have a high view of yourself and a low view of everyone else. We are all the same. We are all equal. And when you put yourself above another person or another tribe, you are asking for trouble. Edom literally looked down on Israel. Edom had the high point and Israel was to be looked down upon. This conflict goes back years. If you hadn't been close, you can't really hate. And Israel had settled on the west side and Edom had settled on the east side. Jacob's descendants on one side and Esau's descendants on the other. God forbid Israel from having a bad attitude towards Edom, but God had near enough no jurisdiction over Edom. God said in Deuteronomy, you must always treat the Edomites right, because they were brothers, Jacob and Esau, and God commanded brotherly love. Obadiah said, you shouldn't have been mean to your brother. He was talking directly to the Edomites. Whenever anyone attacks Israel, the Edomites join in. The Babylonians would take, they were a cruel nation when they were fighting, and they would take the babies by their foot and smash their heads on rocks, spilling their brains everywhere. And the Edomites joined in. The Edomites egged them on. When the Philistines attacked Jerusalem, the Edomites joined in. When the Arabs attacked Jerusalem, the Edomites joined in. When the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, the Edomites joined in. And they took every opportunity to bash Israel. They weren't capable themselves, but when they saw anyone else attacking Israel, they would be there. God condemns their hatred of Israel and their lack of brotherly love. You shouldn't have done this, and you shouldn't, and you're going to get judged for it. Did they hear what Obadiah said? And for the and if they did they heed it? He talks in the third person in the first part of his book, which talks about they, and then he changes to the second person, which talks about you. So this tells us he plucked up the courage to go to Petra and tell them to their face, because if the first half of the book he addresses them as they, and the second half he changes to address them as you. It's no wonder that prophets were killed, and they were killed one after another. So what happened to the Edomites? In the 6th century BC, Arabs attacked them and they fled over the Rift Valley into the Negev Valley, and it was renamed Idumea after the Edomites had come. And then an Edomite came from the Negev, went to Rome to talk to Julius Caesar, and asked for the kingdom of Israel in Jerusalem to be sold to him. His name was Herod. Yes, that Herod. Herod the Idumean, the Edomite. Herod, the great king over Israel. The Edomite was now king of the Jews. Herod the Great was king of the Jews. And he said, now I am going to build greater cities than the Nabateans are building in my old city of Petra. And that's why he rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. That's why he built palaces everywhere. And that's why he built the palace in Masada. Then you get these wise men coming from goodness knows where and asking about the King of the Jews. He was furious, and in his fury and anger, after he'd let them go pretending to be nice, he killed all of the babies in that area. I'm not having a Jew on this throne. Hiya Constance, Connie, I'll get there in the end. And he killed every boy in Bethlehem. We are starting to talk through the 12 minor prophets, and we're on Obadiah, the first one. His son was Herod, who had John the Baptist killed. Hi, Brian. And to whom Jesus said nothing. His grandson was Herod, who was eaten by worms in the book of Acts. And his great-grandson was known as Agrippa, who died in AD 100 without children. And the Edomites have disappeared. And it all happened because Obadiah saw it happen and said it would happen. It's amazing how Jacob and Esau, their battle nearly killed Jesus. How Jesus stood on trial before an Edomite. Maybe that was God's final roll of the dice for the Edomites. Maybe that was their last chance to do something good for the people of Israel. But God takes his time about judging people. From Obadiah to their final disappearance was 910 years. But what God says, he does. Longfellow wrote, "The mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceeding small. Though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness grinds he all." When God says he'll do something, it may take thousands of years, but he'll do it eventually. The God of Israel will one day judge all people, especially for their attitude towards his people. Then he says, one day Israel will possess Edom, because this is part of the land that he included specifically in the land of that God promised to his people. And one day they must attain this land between Gaza and the Euphrates. And Obadiah saw it coming. In verses 17 to 21, he sees Israel expanding to the north into Ephraim and Samaria, to the south into the Negev, to the east into the Edom hills, and as far as the Mediterranean coast in the west. Obadiah saw it and describes it as if it had already happened. There's a Jacob and an Esau in all of us. And it says in Hebrews, don't be an Esau who sold his birthright for a pot of soup. Be a Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God until God lamed him, but he got his blessing. Esau lived for the present and for the immediate satisfaction of his physical desires, and he lost his birthright and his future for that. They don't care about the future. Just like Herod, who was so bothered about his own sexual desires, he was willing to give up half his kingdom to a dancing girl, who eventually asked for the head of John the Baptist. But Herod was willing to give up his whole kingdom just for his sexual desires, just for that moment of pleasure. That's the Esau syndrome. The Esau's of this world live for the flesh and live for this world only. Be a Jacob. Be broken by God. But he got his kingdom because a prince changed his name to Israel, whose name has been on the map for 2,000 years. When God speaks, he keeps his word. Little Obadiah, a minor prophet, but everything he said has and will come true. Now that's the story of Obadiah. We've begun to look at the 12 minor prophets, and as I said right at the beginning, they're not minor because what they did. We don't know whether this was the only thing that Obadiah said. He may have been a prolific speaker and this was the only thing that he wrote down. On the other hand, he may have been a one-off prophet, prophesying about this one thing. But the essence of the story is incredible. It's basically saying to the world that the God of the Israelites, the God of the Christian, is the God of everyone. And Obadiah says this right out of the bat. And this would have been a revolutionary thought at the time. This would have been unheard of, because everybody, every tribe and every people had their own gods, and gods plural. And here's the God of the Jews turning round and saying, ultimately, I am going to judge everyone. I am going to be the judge of every nation. And the thing that's going to hold me in sway is how you've treated my people, how you've treated the Israelites, how you've treated the Jews, and subsequently how you've treated the Christians who form the church of today. That is an amazing thought, that people are going to be held accountable for how they treat the Christians of today. When you've got Christians being murdered left, right and centre, the Egyptian Coptic Christians having their heads chopped off as they're going into church, having buses blown up. It's quite incredible that God has openly said, and he's openly said thousands upon thousands of years ago. He's talking through Obadiah nearly 1,000 years before Christ was born. So he's telling people, you better treat my people well. You better take them into account. And he's openly showing people that he is God, because he wipes the Edomites off the face of the earth. He's wiping effectively one of his children's lines off the face of the earth. And yet we take no notice, and we take less notice these days than they ever took. Obadiah was a warning to every nation under the sun. And let's face it, it's not a long rambling book. It's one page, it's 21 verses. Anybody can read it. And yet we take no notice in our government, in our lawmakers, nothing. And we're still trampling down Israel now. But one day, according to Obadiah, Israel will rise up, and Israel will have all of that land that God promised them. Israel will come back to the forefront and obtain all this land. I don't know how they're going to do it, but if God says that they're going to do it, believe that they're going to do it. That's the story of Obadiah and the first of the 12 minor prophets. The next prophet we're going to look at is Joel, and that'll be next week. And we will get stuck into Joel. And as I said, it's the minor prophets were talking to Israel and Judah at sometimes different times, sometimes the same time. But we'll work our way through all the minor prophets, and you don't mess with Israel. And loads of countries have tried, and they still keep coming back. But we will go through the minor prophets, and then maybe we'll have a look at Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. And after we've done that, but that's way in the future. We're gonna spend quite a few weeks on the minor prophets. If you have any questions or anything, please put them in the comments below, and I will endeavour to answer them. That's if I can. I'm not the font of all knowledge, and as I've said before, all of this stuff is out there for anybody to track down. It's just a matter of as one friend of mine told me, I've taken the time to put it all together and put it into this podcast. So that's our up, and I'll see you next time. God bless you, and good listening. And remember, it's always good to read through the books of the Bible in their entirety. And I challenge you to go and read Obadiah. It's only one page, 21 verses. Go and read it and see what you get out of it. God bless.